Thank you very much. So this is, as Dr. Matara said, so my name is Selina Sanu, and I'm the head of programs for the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, calling in from Nairobi, Kenya. And we are a partner of the Glasgow Caledonian University. And this is a study that we did together with GCU in collaboration with universities in Africa, the universities in Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Gabon, Ghana, Kenya, Morocco, Nigeria, and South Africa. And the aim of the study, first of all, the title of the study is The Impact of COVID-19 on the Nationally Determined Contributions Implementation in Africa. And the aim of the study was to highlight key challenges, opportunities, and recommendations for climate action and the implementation of the NDCs during COVID-19 pandemic and future crises of this nature. So we realized that, of course, especially 2020 being the year of the review of the NDCs, and then comes the pandemic, that of course had a lot of impact and a lot of negative, of course, impact on the reviews and the implementation of the NDCs in most countries worldwide. And we thought this study in these 8 countries will provide us a clear demonstration of what the challenges are. So the objectives of the study was to document evidence and insights from the organizations involved, the climate action in the wake of COVID-19 through online surveys and interviews. So that was one of the objectives. The second objective was to identify challenges and opportunities that face organizations at the front line of climate crisis during the pandemic, and lastly, provide recommendations on addressing some of the challenges and encapsulating the views of the people and organizations who have contributed to the study. So the study overview, so this was a qualitative online survey of respondents from 68 organizations based in the 8 countries that I had cited earlier on. 38 interviews with senior and middle-level 38 interviews with senior and middle-level employees from government, civil society, private sector, financial research, and the United Nations organizations and agencies. So those were the interviews of the interviews done with the middle and senior level employees from those institutions. The findings are as follows. So I'm going to share with you the findings of, out of all this in the categories that we are looking at for analysis. So COVID-19 has disrupted climate action momentum and activities in the run up to COP26. So that was very clear. That was a finding. It was very clear that the pandemic has come and it has disrupted climate action momentum, especially running up to COP26. So a majority of the respondents reported COVID-19 has had a significant negative impact on their organization's focus and activities on climate action. That was a key response for most of the respondents. If I can take an example from an employee from Morocco, he said that COVID-19 has paralyzed the activity of climate action. For example, of the postponement of the COP26, the coordination is in slow motion. So of course, we did not have COP26 as planned in 2020, and that was a real key. That was a very negative impact, of course, by the pandemic. COVID-19 related public health measures have hindered NDC consultations and wider negotiations. So the majority of the respondents reported COVID-19 will have a significant negative effect on climate policy and the NDC development process in their countries. This is what is coming out from most of them. However, if I take somebody from the ministry from Ghana, just to hear that voice, it says COVID-19 has actually affected the delivery of our activities. Almost all meetings, especially for 2020, that were scheduled to actually advance the implementation of the NDCs were affected because face-to-face meetings were not permitted. So most of our countries went into lockdowns, and as we went into lockdowns and curfews, some of the curfews in Kenya are still ongoing. We still have limitations of the number of people that can have a face-to-face meeting. So this is a clear example of what the pandemic has done. COVID-19 has disrupted the implementation of NDCs and the development-related projects overall. So a majority of the respondents reported COVID-19 would have a significant negative effect on their governments and other development actors' response to climate change and commitment to climate action. And hearing from a senior level from Minister of Agriculture in Ethiopia, he says COVID-19 is affecting not only the NDCs, but the overall implementation of our regular development plans. Now we try to revise our plans in order to recapture what we lost during COVID-19. And I think this is very common with all of us right now. For example, we are working with institutions in the region in Africa, and we are saying institutions like the Pan-African Climate, Pan-African parliamentarians, we're working also with the REX, and we are really advising them, based even on this study, that they have to realign now all their plans with what is happening as a result of the pandemic. It's no longer business as usual. The economic impacts of COVID-19 have raised concerns about finance and resource allocation for conditional NDCs. So the majority of our respondents reported that COVID-19 will have a significant negative effect on the availability, allocation, and delivery of climate aid and finance in their countries. So as we turn towards addressing COVID-19, we tend now to allocate all funds there, and we tend to ignore programs or monies that have been allocated to, for example, climate aid. So this is becoming a real challenge in our countries. For example, a senior level employee from Kenya Forest Service says COVID-19 is going to affect the resource allocation, both locally and internationally. It is going to delay the process because some of the targets we are to implement rely on finances. The moment funding is delayed, implementation will delay. So what is interesting is when monies for climate, for example, climate finance, they trickle down slow. They're not coming in on time. The climate finance has these regulations that are very difficult for countries and for civil society organizations, for example, to implement, to access and implement work. But the moment the pandemic was here, everything just turned. There's all of a sudden there's so much money that is being put into the pandemic, and the other sectors tend to suffer as a result of that. The economic impact of COVID-19. The economic impacts of COVID-19 have also raised concerns about the resilience of local communities. So a large majority of the respondents also reported COVID-19 has had significant negative impact on the resilience of local communities to climate impacts. Now, hearing from somebody from Nigeria, the impact of COVID-19 was devastating, especially with no early warning, early response mechanism in place. Business activities came to a halt, movement was restricted, people stayed indoors for long periods of time without food or palliatives. Others took to risk behavior to eke out a livelihood. Others quarantined even when their illnesses were not COVID related. This was really devastating, especially at the onset of COVID-19. In a country like Kenya, schools were closed, so we had a lot of children staying home, and we reported a high level of pregnancies with school-going age girls as a result of this. Police brutality. You don't wear a mask in the streets, you are late in curfew. We've had people lose their lives as a result of the heavy-handedness of the government as a result of COVID-19. So this is really, it's really an impact that is very negative. The climate action is a priority for post-COVID-19 recovery. So the climate action is a priority for post-COVID-19 recovery. A majority of the respondents reported climate action is a moderately to very important priority in their countries post-COVID recovery plans. So we'll be hearing one of our partners from Abantu for Development in Ghana. She said Ghana's government aims to use the recently launched National Adaptation Plans process to build back better, ensuring that post-COVID-19 recovery investments and stimulus packages are climate-proof. And I'm even saying we need to go beyond that. Even right now, before we go into the post period, COVID-19 and climate action, they are a twin problem, and they need to be implemented with an approach, a wholesale approach that addresses both of them. You cannot address the other one and leave the other one out. They are a twin problem. They are related, and they need to be addressed simultaneously. That is what I personally think. Civil society has a major role to play in shaping, implementing, and raising ambitions for the NDCs and climate action. An overwhelming majority of respondents, the civil society and social movements should have an important role in guiding the action of COVID-19 in their countries. So the post-COVID-19 should be driven from below, with more informed participation to determine a future which is just and sustainable, with more respect of human rights, the rights of nature, including restoration of people's dignity. And I've just described what is happening in Kenya, which is really against human rights, against people's rights, and it is not. It is brutal. And if we do not work from the bottom up and involve all sectors of society, the communities, the civil society, then we are not going to get anything that is sustainable as we build back better. So our recommendations from the study are as follows. Climate change should be treated as an emergency in the same way as the COVID-19 pandemic. So somebody from Ghana says tackling climate change as an issue of emergency as it is being done by COVID-19. I think the same attention should be given to climate change because of the consequences it has on the lives of people, especially those living under poor conditions. What is so interesting is when 2021 COVID-19 hit, I have never seen so much solidarity and so much solidarity and so much, whether it was civil society on their own or civil society with other sectors coming together, but there was a lot of conversation and a lot of coordination around this pandemic. How come we never do the same when we look at other sectors, for instance, climate change? Why not this kind of money? Why not this kind of solidarity? Why not this kind of coordination? So we are recommending that they should go hand in hand. A holistic approach to COVID-19 climate change and other social economic challenges is needed. Somebody from Gabon says the situation created by COVID-19 should be taken advantage of to forge links, synergies, complementarities between the different sectors through the SDGs and the objectives of the NDCs. New plans, this is from Cote d'Ivoire, new plans and programs should take into account the correlation between health and human living environment in the irreversibility relationship and develop the precautionary and preventive capacity in order to strengthen the resilience of populations in the face of the threat global. Other recommendations include the adapt COVID-19 response coordination strategies to climate action efforts. The major lesson that I saw that during this COVID-19 pandemic, the coordination that we have never seen before between stakeholders, the non-governmental, government and private NGOs, different stakeholders, but this only happens because of the pandemic. This is a lesson that we need to somehow build upon for the future. That is coming from Ethiopia, and that is what I had said earlier on, because I saw it myself. We did a lot of collaboration only because of the pandemic. And the scare that the pandemic was causing in our lives. Dedicated domestic and international funding to finance a climate resilient recovery. My first point on the action would be getting a dedicated domestic funding, because that is the foundation of everything that we want to do as a country. So going forward as a country, with the understanding that COVID has actually made us understand that we had to be on our own to do a lot of things. This is coming from Ghana, and this is really critical, because when the pandemic came, it really tested our systems, especially our health systems. It showed us of how unprepared we are. It is worse than the Ebola that we get regularly. This really tested our systems, our finances, our resilience as a continent. And so therefore, really, we need to take action to ensure that we have dedicated domestic funding. And here we are calling also for the address of illicit capital flows that is leaving our country so that the money can stay in the continent and we are able to respond to emergencies of this nature. Follow the lessons on raising awareness and rapid knowledge co-production learned as part of the pandemic response. This is coming from Morocco. Knowledge generation together with awareness creation are two important issues that we had learned from the country's response to COVID-19. Another important lesson that we had learned is with regards to coordination. The coordination among various stakeholders for addressing COVID-19 was very good. We need to have similar coordination mechanisms for climate action. A renewed focus on government intervention. The entire world did realize that government is the go-to in the pandemic response. It was not NGOs or civil society. They did their bit. Don't forget me that the government through lockdown, social protection measures, and other strategies, they should do more in taking action in climate action. I am not very sure. This came from the study, so we've got to take it the way it is. I'm Kenyan. I am not very sure whether I really agree with that 100%, given what is still going on in this country as we speak. And lastly, promoting innovation and digital connectivity. The huge implementation of digital advocacy by civil society organizations has really helped to strengthen and sustain climate action during the COVID-19 pandemic. This should be replicated by other countries. This is a recommendation from Nigeria, and taking different tasks virtually, because the new normal, this may create a good opportunity to work virtually with all, also from different parts of the country, finding solutions for such kind of crisis. This is coming from Ethiopia. So those were our findings from the study. If you really want to read the study, and we welcome you to do that, you can go to our website, you'll find it there. It's PACJA, www.pacja.org, and you'll see that. We also have a Twitter handle that you can always tweet and let us know what you think about the study. The same thing was also, I think our colleagues also at GCU have similar things. Thank you very much. Dr. Matar, I'm returning it back to you, and I hope I didn't exceed the time to do this.
Thank you very much, Selena. And I think that gives a very good overview of the wide range of impacts we're seeing because of COVID-19 on the impact of climate change in Africa. And I'm just to remind our audience, if you had any particular questions or on that research or some general questions, please put your questions in the chat box as the presentations progress, and we'll come back to them during the panel discussion. So now I'm going to share a presentation by Dr. Michael Mikulevic, the research fellow at the Center for Climate Justice, who has kindly done a recording on a recent project looking at the lived experience of communities in Malawi and Rwanda with climate change and COVID-19. So if you bear with me just a moment.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the event. My name is Michael Mikulevic. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Climate Justice at Glasgow Caledonian University. And today I'm going to deliver a presentation on the initial findings of a project that we are just about to conclude called CCC19, or Climate Change and COVID-19, Achieving a Sustainable and Equitable Recovery in Malawi and Rwanda. So this is a project funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund. So it's a publicly funded project that we we secured in 2020. And we are now, just like I said, about to conclude it. But I'm going to share today with you some initial findings of the project. I'm going to talk about what the project is about, what kind of questions it asked, what kind of methods we used to obtain the data, and then some initial results that of the analysis that is currently ongoing. So in terms of the project objectives, we first of all wanted to develop the capacity of our partners, of which there are 5. To deliver this project, we really wanted to offer them professional development opportunities, which we did, and we will, and I will talk about that a little bit in a second. Then we wanted to develop new knowledge on the links between COVID-19 and climate change. So the main premise of this project is that climate change and COVID-19 are crises that are related, not in terms of cause and effect, obviously, but in terms of how they impact local livelihoods. And they are 2 different crises. One is a public health crisis. The other one is environmental climate crisis. So we wanted to make these links apparent through our analysis. And then we wanted to compare the situation of the most vulnerable groups in local communities in Malawi and Rwanda, which is where we conducted our field work in those two African countries. And then our last objective is to deliver recommendations to stakeholders in Malawi, Rwanda, and the UK to make sure that these findings that we have produced are taken into consideration when planning development interventions in the future. So let me start with the researcher training program that I briefly mentioned a few seconds ago. So as part of this project, we really wanted to offer our partners in Africa an opportunity to develop their professional skills. So to that end, we actually asked them, what kind of training needs they had, and that's how we came up with this program. So just very quickly, there were sessions on how to do qualitative methods research, on gender equality, research ethics, working with policymakers, how to write academic articles, and so forth. And also we are planning currently an exchange visit between our partners in Malawi and Rwanda for 6 project staff members. So this is something that was added, so to speak, to the project on top of what was supposed to be done, just to make sure that we have that capacity on the ground to conduct it. There we go. So in terms of methods, we had 2 key participant groups, community members and representatives from government, development sectors, civil society, and private sectors, or collectively as we call them, the practitioners. And we conducted over 1,200 surveys, 80 interviews. You can see them here on the screen. One novel method that we employed was photo voice, which basically means that we went to the local villages and asked people to talk to the camera and explain the challenges that they have been facing because of climate change and COVID-19. And I'm going to show you a recording of that shortly. In terms of the countries, like I mentioned, we conducted our analysis in Malawi and Rwanda, and you can see here in the on these maps the locations where we conducted interviews, photo voice, and the surveys. And so I'm not going to get into this, just to give you an overview of where we actually went. In terms of the initial findings, in terms of numbers of the survey results, we completed over 1,200 surveys. Almost 60% of our participants were women, 65% were migrants, or considered themselves migrants. 56% were in primary education, so had completed a primary education degree, and almost 60% were heads of household. 82% of participants lived in households with children, 22.6% lived in households with seniors 60 years old or more. The main source of livelihood for most of our participants was agriculture, as we expected, although we did think we would have a bigger percentage here, which is very interesting, that people are perhaps moving away from agriculture as their main source of income because of climate change and other impacts. 40% live in informal settlements, so they usually don't have a title, they don't own their house, they are temporary residents and so forth. And 66% own their houses. There we go. So in terms of the self-identified vulnerable group that I mentioned at the beginning, we wanted to we didn't actually want to establish from the beginning who the vulnerable groups are. So instead of this, we asked people that we did research with, our participants, about who the vulnerable groups in their communities were. So that's why we call them self-identified vulnerable groups. And you can see here it's quite a wide array of different social groups, from people who are landless, seniors, people who are HIV positive, people who are unemployed, people who are living in high-risk zones, persons with disabilities, young people, unmarried women and widows, and so forth and so forth and so forth. So this was very interesting to see that different people see different groups as particularly vulnerable, but we kind of adopted this approach to make sure that we don't exclude anybody from this. And in terms of the current challenges that our participants were facing at the moment, at the time of the surveys, a vast majority, 69%, said that it's the COVID-19 pandemic, and only 15% said climate change or the changing weather, which in a way it's not very surprising. that COVID pandemic is global and is affecting people all over the place, no matter where they live. But it was good to confirm that is indeed the case, because there were some suggestions out there saying that Africans are not as affected by COVID-19 because of the low penetration of the virus on the continent. But you can see here that it doesn't mean that because we're not impacted. And let me see. Further information we received as part of the data collection in local communities. 78% of our participants experience an unusual situation affecting household's ability to provide for itself. In most cases, that was the COVID pandemic. Sometimes it was a flood or a drought or something else altogether. But we wanted to keep it very general and ask if there was something unusual over the last, I believe, year that has happened to our participants. Worryingly, 73% of our participants said that there were times that their household did not have enough food in the past month to feed all their household members properly. And the vast majority did not receive any kind of food assistance over the last year. So that also is definitely concerning, given the statistic here of the 73%. Almost half of our participants said that their household expenses were over what they could afford, and over half of them described their health, as poor. So in terms of the extreme weather examples that our participants reported, on the side of Malawi, one of the two countries, they mentioned strong winds and hailstorms. On the side of Rwanda, we heard about cold weather in the mountains and dry spells in other parts of the country. But most of the impacts were actually common for both Malawi and Rwanda. And so we saw flooding, droughts, irregular rainfall being mentioned very, very frequently. And before, we also asked a question about what was the most important thing before, in terms of the challenges. What was the most important challenge before the pandemic? And that was definitely flooding and droughts. So climate impacts, which were superseded by the COVID pandemic. And we can expect that once the pandemic is under control in these countries, the concerns related to climate change will definitely return. Almost half of our households have not at all recovered from losses caused by the problem before the pandemic. So that was pre-COVID-19. And the climatic changes they face have become a bigger problem than a year ago. That's 86% of individuals said that climate is actually changing for the worse as far as their livelihoods are concerned. And the same percentage said that they did not have the required money to deal with erratic weather. And these impacts of climate change require investment. For example, if you're a farmer, you very often have to buy more fertilizer or more pesticides or hire more labor to ensure that your fields are tended to. And sometimes they require more attention than usual. This is not even to mention irrigation schemes, which are usually out of the question for most of these individuals. And over half of our participants said they did not have the required knowledge and skills to deal with the with erratic weather events. So that's also a skill or knowledge gap there on the ground. So how did our participants adapt to these impacts of climate change? In Malawi, there was a mention of sharing land, establishing village banks, sharing food and clothing. There was also mention of illicit activities such as firewood and charcoal sale, which is frowned upon, to say the least, by the government. On the Rwanda side, people have tried to store water, rainwater, to diversify their livelihoods. Very often Rwandans were saying that they are just trying to be patient and calm and try to weather the storm. So that was also quite interesting, a cultural reaction perhaps to it. But in most cases, again, the strategies were the same in both countries in terms of relocation or trying to irrigate, planting trees, securing your roofs. When it's windy or when there's a storm. A lot of people have reported issues with their roofs, so basically holes in their roofs and so forth. Shifting crop choices and cultivation patterns was also on the agenda. However, it again requires investment. If you want to switch your production to a different crop, you definitely have to invest in the right seeds, and you have to sometimes invest in new equipment and so forth. So most people, unfortunately, don't have that kind of capital. Now, moving on to the COVID-19 responses, 42% said that is the most important problem affecting their household right now, compared to 19% for floods and droughts. And these problems, whether it's the COVID-19 pandemic or flooding and droughts, 92% of respondents said that this problem caused a significant reduction or loss of income. And again, worryingly, 76%, over 3/4 of our respondents have not recovered from these losses at all. And half of them borrowed money or got food on credit from friends and family to compensate for these losses. So this is just to give you an idea of what kind of impacts the COVID-19 pandemic combined with climate change has had on people's livelihoods on the ground, and how little external assistance they are receiving to deal with them. And then we asked about the impact of COVID-19 on local livelihoods. And here we basically saw very, very similar responses in both countries, in Malawi and in Rwanda. So decreased income, very much like in many cases in the West. Living in constant fear, increased care duties for women because, for example, schools had to close and that meant that children had to stay at home. Poverty and food insecurity was broadly mentioned as well. Markets were closed, so there was no way to sell your produce if you're a farmer. Domestic violence against children, that's what we heard during our interviews. Not getting treatment for diseases and so forth. These are just the main impacts that our participants have recorded. So we also asked the question, how has life changed? And you can just read here the many ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic has changed local lives and livelihoods, starting from difficulties in obtaining food and traveling, shortage of commodities, lost access to healthcare, people getting off insurance, off private insurance. For example, in Rwanda, you have to pay for health insurance, and some people decided not to continue with that, which is definitely a problem if you're living in a pandemic situation. Limiting social interactions, disruption of the informal economy. So there were very few temporary jobs. A lot of traders or farmers who used to hire laborers to tend to their fields decided to do that themselves and save some money. So that had a knock-off effect on other individuals that would normally make money thanks to them. And then just to conclude, we asked about their physical health right now versus before the pandemic, and we definitely saw a change for the worse currently. You can see that only 15% of people describe their health as fair, for example, compared to 33% before the pandemic, and the situation is reversed with the poor health. It was reported by 52% now versus 33% before the pandemic. And also we asked about mental health, which sometimes is overlooked by development work, but is no less important. And also we asked the question about before and after the pandemic. So we saw a change in the poor and good responses, as you can see here. Not as drastic as in the physical health, but still a change for the worse. And I'm not going to get into this too much. This is how households adapted to the COVID-19 pandemic. Some people got vaccinated. Some people took loans to compensate for the income. The usual, social distancing, wearing masks, washing hands, was predominant in both countries. Some people actually said they did nothing; they didn't even have money for sanitizers or soap, as a matter of fact. So you can see that what kind of challenges people had to deal with at the very, very local level. Just to conclude here, excuse me. So the next step for us as the project team is to make further links between climate change and COVID-19 based on the responses from our participants. Many of our participants didn't actually make direct links between those two crises because that was a bit too abstract for them to do. And they usually focus on the most immediate challenge, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. But based on the responses that we got in the photo voices, in the surveys, and the interviews, we as researchers are able to make these connections on our own based on that feedback from participants. So we saw that the pressure on the environment will probably decrease. Tree planting will continue. There will be less reliance, for example, on charcoal production and cutting down trees for firewood. And resilience building towards climate change impacts will continue once incomes rebound. And that's the return of trade, tourism, and migration. And migration is a very powerful adaptation strategy that was basically impossible to adopt during the lockdowns. Planning for the future will be easier. A lot of our participants said that it's just basically impossible to plan long term at this point. I think that's something that a lot of us can identify with and sympathize with. But at the same time, a lot of our respondents said that they expect long-term effects of COVID-19. They expect them to linger, basically, and the challenges for development will be basically long-lasting because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then a lot of our participants mentioned that climate change education and funding decreased during the pandemic because resources were needed for dealing with COVID-19 outbreaks in these countries. So the question here is, will the climate change education and funding levels return in the same form as they were before? And this is not to say they were sufficient in the beginning. or to begin with. But definitely, there's something that we have to keep in mind. It's not obvious that that funding will return. Specifically in Rwanda, there was no reliance. There was no umuganda or ibikumbi, which are basically umuganda is getting together of a community once a month to work on community projects that increases community cohesion and social enhances social capital. The argument goes. So these activities were stopped during the pandemic, and I believe they are still on hold. So what kind of role does this have on climate resilience is another question that we have to look into. So just to conclude really quickly, COVID-19 is not just a public health crisis the way we tend to think of it in the West, including the UK. It's a development emergency. It has deep, cutting economic, social, cultural, and political implications that our participants and ourselves also believe that will linger for years and possibly for decades to come. The kind of development work that was undermined because of the pandemic is immense, and a lot of effort and many funding streams will be needed to get us back to where we were. In fact, some participants fear that they will have to build everything from scratch. That's a direct quote from one of our participants. Like I said, undermining development and resilience built to date. So I'm going to conclude here on the COVID pandemic. Just to reflect really quickly on COP26. What is the importance of all this for COP26? Well, we know that COVID-19 will be on the agenda during the conference, as will be resilience building and adaptation to climate change. We have to make sure that this kind of research is communicated to policymakers, to negotiators, to decision makers, because very often the aid that is earmarked is not just insufficient, but also is directed towards projects or activities that are not necessarily in tune with local needs. And that's something that we saw in this project. There were many instances where we heard of coping strategies that we couldn't even think of ourselves. We wouldn't know unless we actually asked people on the ground. People on the ground are extremely creative and resilient. So it's very important that this kind of assistance, whether it's climate related or COVID-19 related, is in tune with local needs. And for that, we need to conduct research of this kind. So research that is focused on local, very local needs. So, you know, in addition to what Selina mentioned in her presentation on national responses and national level needs, we have to also look at the local level, because it's not always the case that national governments will reflect the needs of local governments or even local communities. So it's very important to do research at different levels, and you would probably expect to hear that from a geographer like myself. But I think that it's very important to get the big picture of the entire problem, and the picture is quite complex because people locally deal both with climate change impacts and now with COVID-19 impacts, both in terms of health impacts and economic impacts, cultural impacts on their livelihoods. So I will conclude here. Thank you very much. I am sorry I couldn't be there with you live, but if you have any questions for me, I'm very happy to answer them over email. You can see my email address there, and if you'd like to learn more about the CCC19 project, you can find the web address on the slide. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the event.
So, thank you for just to say thank you to Michael, because obviously not with us right now, but as I say, if you have any interest in following up at the CC19 project, please send him an email. He was also mentioning about potentially playing a video in part of that presentation, but if you go to the CC19.Africa, you'll be able to see on the website there's some lived live stories, recordings of which you can see of different stories from the communities of which that research project was taking place. So now we're going to move on to a panel discussion, and I would like to invite Selena and Beth, if you could turn on your webcams. Unfortunately, we're having a few internet troubles over in Malawi, so Dr. Kirambo might not be able to join us, but if he is able to join us later, we'll add him into the conversation. So as we've just been hearing then about all the impacts across both at the national level and then this local level, and I think it would be wonderful if we could bring in Professor Kipling to share some of your thoughts on the research and why it matters for COP26.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone here for joining, and I'm really pleased to be following those two really interesting data-driven presentations. And I was asked to talk about the implications of our research for the COP26 and the pursuit of climate justice at the negotiations. And I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of our research project, and I want to acknowledge our field assistants in Rwanda, and also the academic staff who participated in the project from University of Rwanda and our partner institutions here in the country. And as Shannon said, my name is Beth Kaplan. I'm a professor here at University of Rwanda and also the director of the Center of Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resource Management. So I want to start by talking about what we can see when we do some exploration about what are the priorities for the COP26. And you can find that inclusive action, in particular promoting fair, inclusive climate action, is one of the main priorities for these upcoming negotiations. And especially the COP aims to mobilize a step up in climate action and keep hope alive, that we can have meeting the tough goal of the Paris Agreement, which is limiting the global temperature rise. And so that means we need to reduce the emissions more quickly and more deeply, and we need to adapt to different kinds of climate impacts that are happening, and also scale up the financial support for developing nations that need to build these low carbon resilient economies. So you've already seen some data from some other studies. What I want to focus on is what our research showed from Rwanda in terms of how this links to the negotiations, what it can mean for the COP26 and climate justice. And so first I want to mention the importance of listening to community voices, and both of the previous speakers mentioned this as well. To understand the concerns, the needs, and the suggestions with regards to climate change action that is needed, and also to address the global change events like this pandemic, because these kinds of events where we have a crush of impacts from climate change and unpredictable weather events, along with something like a pandemic, this is going to continue happening. And we need to understand from communities, they are being greatly impacted. And as of course, as the data show, and I think as most of us know, and the importance of creating safety nets and systems that can help adapt to these changes that are happening for both economic and environmental resilience. So listening to community voices. Another component from our study is about gender and the issue of intersectionality of vulnerability for women. And in particular, because of these socially constructed gender roles that we have, women do experience COVID and climate change differently. Women are generally the primary caregivers in the home, And any health-related care is then generally put on the women who care for sick family members, and this is especially acute during a pandemic. Women are more likely to be informally employed rather than formally employed, and so the social distancing measures that are more financially threatening to them have a bigger impact. And women are responsible for generally the most responsible in the household for collecting water, firewood, fodder. And so climate change is going to make her life uniquely more difficult. And then she becomes more impoverished because of these events, these pandemic and the effects of climate change. And this becomes even more vulnerable for her. So this is a negative feedback loop of vulnerability that we need to pay attention to in the negotiations. I also want to mention the level of uncertainty that climate change is creating, especially for small scale or smallholder farmers. And this includes the issue of knowledge generation and sharing knowledge about climate change. As things are changing more unpredictably and having greater impact, knowledge generation and sharing becomes more critical. People are increasingly being concerned and affected by negative impacts of climate change. This also showed up in the data. So the ability of small-scale farmers to invest in adaptation, in mitigation, is critical now. And then the role of these development partners becomes even more critical. And another issue is investment in adaptation measures is mainly driven by donors in many African countries. So we need to look at how to build their capacities for self-financing and sustainability going forward, because again, this needs to be durable, needs to be continued, these investments in adaptation. And finally, what innovation incentives exist to promote the investment in climate change? That needs to be explored more deeply and look at adaptation by the private sector. So these are some of the research findings that I can mention from our research project that Michael mentioned. And I would be really happy to answer any questions or any comments that anybody here has. And I want to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you for expanding on some of the specific research outputs which are going to be coming from Rwanda. I mean, yeah, Michael gave that overview, but it's just to remind those in the audience, this is a live project, so you can follow the outcomes of that analysis on the website as they go. So I think, yeah, just to kick off some of the discussion, I think what we've been hearing a lot about, and we were talking about the poorest and most vulnerable being particularly vulnerable, or the particular vulnerable groups who are bearing the brunt of climate change and COVID-19. And you were mentioning, Beth, about women being a particular group who have this very strong correlation between these two events affecting daily life. And we've also heard from Selena on this sort of wider governance aspect of actually of nations who are also being dramatically affected by all of this. And I suppose to get a question was, those countries and individuals and communities who have historically been most affected by climate change have also been historically underrepresented in negotiations on mitigation, adaptation and resilience. So just to kick off, what would you say the consequence of this has been for climate action in the past? What challenges do you foresee for representation of those most affected by climate change at this upcoming COP26? So perhaps I ask Selena if you would like to start to kick off.
So thank you very much, Dr. Matar. Thank you also, Dr. Gablin, for those wonderful comments. I think you've really set the stage of what we need to take to COP26. And COP26 is really critical this time because there were a lot of unfinished business coming from COP25 in Madrid. And these studies that we have listened to this afternoon are capturing those issues. If I can speak from the African perspective, when we were in COP25 in Madrid, we were calling, I mean, as a continent, as Africa, we were reminding, we are reminding the global community that Africa is a continent of special needs and circumstances. That is what we were pushing for when we were in COP26. Of course, we didn't get far, but can you imagine now how special how the continent is today in terms of special needs and circumstances with COVID-19. So for us, as we move to Glasgow, we are going to renew that call in the face of COVID-19 to say, we've always been, we are this continent that never caused any climate change. Okay, bearing the effects of the many years of the industrialized nation affecting the bringing about climate change. So we are that nation. I mean, we are that continent that we need to speak about, and especially now in the case of COVID-19. So for us, that would be a message to bring to Glasgow. I would like also to emphasize on what Dr. Kaplan has said in terms of rural voices, the communities. What we are doing, for example, as PACJA, as the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance right now, is we're focusing so much at the community level because that is where we think that the impact is the greatest. Because we need to build the resilience of communities to address to address climate change, especially during this period of the pandemic. So what we are doing is building the resilience through, working together with the private sector, which is very critical. We need to bring the private sector into the conversation. So what we are doing together was to ensure that the private sector is supporting through provision of livelihoods. For instance, in one region of Kenya, we are working with a private company called Bitco that is doing a lot of work on sunflower. And Bitco is providing seeds to local communities. And they are also supporting the communities through the value chain, and at the same time ensuring that there is a market for these people to sell their products. So it is really a very good relationship that exists between ourselves as a civil society doing the facilitation of the relationship between the rural community and the private sector. And I'm saying that because I think this is where governments have not been very strong supporting rural communities, especially during this time. So as Dr. Kaplan has said, going to Glasgow, I think this is where we really need to bring the message and hammer the message home that building the resilience of communities is key. If we are not working from that point of view, moving bottom up, then we are not doing much in addressing this particular issue. And I also want to speak a little bit more to the finances, to the money. It was agreed by the international community that there will be $100 billion annually for climate finance. That is very clear. It's not something new. That is something that was agreed far back as we agreed on the Paris Agreement. But what has happened up to today is the fact that this money is not coming in. It's not coming in at all. And where it is trickling down, there are a lot of difficulties in assessing them. First of all, communities, especially the CBOs that work at the community level, do not have the capacities to access because one, the regulations are really, really very stringent. For communities, especially women that cannot develop bankable proposals to be able to access that money and be able to use at that level. So first of all, the money is not there. And when it comes down, the regulations, the guidelines are very stringent. Nobody is really accessing the way they should. And recently we were in a climate change development for Africa conference in Cape Verde. And it became very clear also that climate finance is very gender blind. It does not really favor, especially women, in a way that they would access this funding and use it adequately. So that is another message. I think we need to bring that message through our negotiators to speak to the global community and also our governments to say, where is this money that was promised? This is another broken promise coming from the international community. I would like to end also by answering a little bit what Dr. Kaplan also said in her remarks, which I really found very profound, is also the way women are impacted by climate change, and especially during this period of COVID-19. We all know, I don't know about other communities around the world, but in the African community, it is women really that are caregivers. We have pushed for years for remuneration of women's work, because of all the work that they do, fetching firewood, fetching water, giving caregivers, taking care of the elderly. All this work is really put on their heads. And now you can imagine what this caregiving work is doing to them during the pandemic period. With the lockdowns, what can they do? The little businesses that they have, those entrepreneurs, everything is broken down. Then they do not have any support from anybody. So we, as much as we are calling for the remuneration of their work, we are now saying it is time that we really revisit that and remunerate the women, the work that the women are doing, especially women living in rural areas. That needs to be done, because if that is not done, I don't see how they can really get out of this situation right now of the twin problem of climate change and COVID-19. And as we move forward to build back better, I think that should be number one on our agenda, and we need to bring that onto Glasgow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Selena. I think it is good, and then bring you in there, Beth, because obviously we were just hearing then all the specific challenges on actually how do we get these issues of representation into these negotiations, and also hearing how many of them, in many cases, particularly we're talking about climate finance or women's recognition of the role women play in all this debate has never really actually penetrated through. So just also from your perspective, is there particular challenges you see? So, you're on mute, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Not particular challenges per se, because I think we talked about what the challenges are, but what I think is the points, and this was just mentioned just a moment ago, is that in the negotiations, especially in the attempt to meet the Paris Agreement, that's all about the emissions. And then we're talking about these communities in countries in Africa that are so extremely impacted by those emissions, while their countries are not the ones doing the major emissions. So I try to think about ways that we can bring home that fact that while countries that are the greatest emitters are not actually experiencing the largest impacts, there are people that are terribly suffering from this wanton emitting, and I think we need to get really creative at bringing that experience to the countries that are emitting and to the negotiation table to really understand what that lived experience is of what's happening now with climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. And I also see Dr. Kirambo may have been able to join us now. Baxter, are you there?
I did.
Yes, I'm here. Yes, I can be able to hear you.
Sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
Hello.
Brilliant. It's wonderful to have you with us, Baxter. We've just been discussing all the different challenges when it comes to representation of particularly those from the global south and those who have been affected by climate change at the negotiations. And there's a question which has come in from Paul Barrow, apologies, in the chat box now. It says, in view of the huge impact of COVID-19 on many of the climate initiatives, and particularly we've also been talking about communities who've been impacted, he's asking what can be done, and he makes the suggestion of a presumably a huge increase in the vaccination of people. And I think that's perhaps maybe a specific point to look at on when it comes to vaccination, because as we know, and it will also be interesting to hear from those of you based on the continent who are meant to be traveling to COP to represent. So indeed, your thoughts on actually what's the environment right now for the ability for representatives and stakeholders from the continent to actually attend, and what do you think needs to be done, like as a technical way forward? So over to you, Baxter, if you would like to.
I can hear you. Okay, so my thinking here is that hello, are you getting me?
Yes, we're hearing you, brother.
Okay, so my thinking is that we need more representation from, more especially the poor countries, for instance Malawi, where a lot of people face climate change challenges, and yet they are not the ones who have contributed much to those climate change issues. And if you go in the rural areas of the country, you'll find a lot of women struggling with their life just because of climate change issues. A lot of houses being washed down by the heavy rains because of the same climate change issues. And yet, if you go around, these people, they don't contribute much into climate change challenges. And yet they are the ones who are receiving these, they are the recipient of these climate change issues. So I feel like there should be more representation from such countries which are poor, like Malawi. They need to be represented more. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Baxter. And I know, Selena, you've also been looking at this issue of, would you like to jump in?
Yes, I would like to address two issues. One is what we currently call the vaccine appetite. Yeah, because we feel that in the continent we're really discriminated against when it comes to the receiving the vaccine, receiving them on time, and whatever we receive also. I mean, so there is that thing that I call vaccine appetite. Coming from the global north, we are not getting enough to be able to vaccine as many people as we would like to. So that is really an issue that we need to be addressed, and that there should be equity or equality in terms of the vaccine distribution and the vaccine allocation. So that is really that is very critical. Second, as Chirambo, my brother Chirambo is talking about representation. There is no way we will have equal representation of Africa in Glasgow if the British government does not remove certain countries out of the red, what do you call it, the red list. We know Kenya has just gotten out of the we are now not in the red list. Thank God for that. So if the British government gives me a visa and I've had my 2 vaccines, I should be able, and the vaccines I should have between 2 weeks before I travel. So I will be able to be in Glasgow. But it's a huge challenge for many countries. I don't know whether Malawi is still on the red list, but I know Zimbabwe is, and I know many other countries that are still on the red list. So what kind of inclusive COP26 is this one? How inclusive is it going to be if people are not able to travel freely, and now the government is offering a free quarantine period sponsored by the British government, but by the time these people get out of the hotel to join the conversation, it might be a bit too late. So that is also another issue that I think we need to squarely address it, not just as civil society alone, but also as governments. I think we should all join hands with governments and ask the British government why they are doing this to most of these countries. Otherwise, if you don't address that, we will not be able to be in Glasgow for a fair representation. And we've made it very clear as Africa that we do not want a virtual COP, because we want to be there face to face the negotiators and to bring our issues to the table. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I see your mic's on, Beth. Would you want to jump in on that as well?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize what Selena just said. It's really an incredible situation that the UK is making countries go through in terms of the quarantine period, but also on the red list. And from Rwanda, we are on the red list also, but also the UK is not accepting all of the vaccines. So I understand that if, for example, any of us vaccinated in Rwanda, our vaccination certificate will not be accepted. So I think many people don't realize the massive hurdles that people must go through in order to engage in these kind of dialogues and broader global, critically important discussions. And those hurdles and barriers really need to be addressed in order to have climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it perhaps brings us onto a point of, we mentioned all these perhaps hurdles, and there's definitely this need to raise ambition when it comes to climate action, not only getting people's voices who are affected, but getting them in the same room, as well as obviously the actual substance of actual climate action and ambition. So if we just move on to that topic then, because also we know the continent is facing an uphill struggle to act on climate change, despite contributing very little to causing it. And certainly what we've been hearing is the pandemic seems to have stagnated progress on climate action. And I know Selena mentioned on that very strong push from the African negotiating delegation for COP not to be postponed to as it is coming now. Was a very obvious example of progress being stagnated. So I would want to ask the panel, perhaps a little bit of a more positive note, is what do you think needs to change to raise ambition for climate action, specifically in your areas of which you're looking at? What do you see as the areas where there can be positive change, and realistically, I guess? So perhaps I'd bring you back in, Beth. I know you have some areas which I think quite critical to this debate.
Well, yeah, you're asking us, sorry, let me put my video on. You're asking about where the positive areas are. And I certainly think that it's with the communities and giving an enabling environment for communities to be able to engage and implement things that they need to do to build resilience. Because, for example, we know that farmers have a lot of knowledge about how to deal with environmental change, for example, and there sometimes is not a platform for that to be heard and implemented. And what I think is encouraging is that those possibilities are there, and in terms of knowledge and innovations among farmers, smallholder farmers, among women and women's groups, and among youth, and I think that there are a lot of innovations out there. What needs to happen, again, just reiterating, is creating this environment where those voices and those actions can be enabled and carried out, because that's, I think, how we're really going to deal with this dual issue of a pandemic, health issues, and then climate change. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Beth. And I would also like to pose the same question to Selena. Where do you see the positive moves coming next for COP26?
First of all, I would like to say that no matter how hardened we are by these things, how frustrated we might be with the pandemic right now, I also see it as an opportunity. I think it has taken us to a certain level of resilience, and I think it has also been a waking up call for us, as countries, and as human beings, that there will be more issues of this nature as we go forward. So I think this is an opportunity. It provides us the opportunity to build resilience and to be prepared for anything that might come beyond COVID-19. So this is quite an opportunity, and I think it's something positive. We may look at it all the time as negative because of the challenges that it brings, but we may also want to look at it from a very positive point of view. So I wanted to open it with that. Where do I see more? More funding for adaptation. If we can look at that, I think that will really assist, especially for those of us who are in the global south. Adaptation is really key. So more funding for this, for us to be able to positively address the issues of climate change. That is one area I would like to do. The other area, positive thing that we can do is we can now link COVID-19, climate change, and debt. Now, let's move from the twin problem to a triple problem, because this is now the triple problem. The debt comes on top of it. And if we could also call for nations to address the debt, say asking the wealthy nations to wipe out the debt for countries in the global south that are not able to do this, and then are grappling with COVID and they're grappling with climate change. That would be really useful because that will help us do this. But also not to just cancel the debt, but also to advise countries of the global south to stop borrowing. There is no. This is the time to stop borrowing instead of making yourself so indebted with all these monies that you are not ever able to pay back. So if we can address now the triple problem, I think that is also something very positive that can assist us to address climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Selena. And I would also put the same question to Baxter, as we're ending towards the end of our session now, is where do you see these positive movements coming, particularly in your area? And I know that's a very strong and relevant area.
Yeah, maybe the first thing which I can say that when COVID-19 just came in, there was a lot of anxiety around the communities, and the business had shut down, and a lot of people could not work, people were not able to move. And then because of a lot of deaths, there are some other families which are now crippled. However, with the coming in of COVID-19, to the positive side of which is that maybe I can say because most Africans are used to having problems. I'm sorry to mention this. Now, with the coming in of COVID-19, initially it was a big scare, but then they have learned a lot from the COVID-19, and now I can put it like they're more stronger mentally in terms of how to manage themselves, and then how to look at the unforeseen circumstances, because this came in as an unforeseen circumstance. At the same time, it has also been like a wake-up call to the governments, because most of people in our areas usually go for full hand-to-mouth type of work. Now, because of that, because of coming in of COVID-19, it meant that they were not able to do those hand-to-work piece of works. So a lot of starvation came into being as well. Now, at the same time, people have now learned that climate change and COVID-19, all of them have a greater impact on people. So I've seen a rise in the use of solar energy. So the use of solar energy, I've seen it rising. And to me, that's a positive part where we can stop cutting down of trees to make charcoal, for which can also increase the problems of climate change. At the same time, what I've also seen is that our governments, they were ill prepared in terms of how to manage such situations. Yes, we have disaster departments in our governments, but I don't think they were fully prepared that such a thing can happen. So with the coming in of COVID-19, I think now our governments have now waken up from the slumber wherever they were and start planning to say, what if in case something like this happens again in the future, what should we be able to do? So the other thing which I can say is now to address such problems of COVID-19, climate change and the like, I think we need more funding, because as I said before, a lot of people, they do hand to mouth type of work, and we need more funding so that people can go into sustainable activities where even if such climate change issues can come, they will still be able to survive. Or even if COVID-19, whether it's the phase number 6 or so, can still come, people will be able to still survive. So it's still more funding to people so that they can be able to adapt to such issues, and more funding so that a lot of groups can be formulated which can increase their resilience to such climate change issues, as well as COVID-19. I think that's what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you, Baxter. And as we now end in this session, I would just like to thank everyone for joining us and our panelists with the presentations from Selina Sanu from PACJA, Dr. Miko Elgwich from the Center for Climate Justice, Professor Beth Kaplan from the University of Rwanda, and Dr. Griffin Karamba from Mzuzu University. If you enjoyed, if you found these insightful, we will be releasing a recording also of this, of these presentations and these discussions, which you're more than free to share with your colleagues. And I think we've seen some very critical messages on not only how the intersection of climate change and COVID is affecting local communities, it's also affecting nations on a very broad and wide variety of ways. But we also hear that there are focuses here. There are ways that the voices of those who are most affected. We've heard what the challenges are. We've also heard what we can bring to COP26 really to make sure that climate action is not only effective, but it's fair and it addresses actually where the need is the most. And I think we've heard some really critical examples of where the focus of that debate needs to be.